Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're doing something seriously ambitious. We're going to condense about 16,000 years of history into one sitting to figure out exactly how the modern nation of Canada was forged. And look, this isn't just a dusty list of dates and treaties. No, it's this wild story of how an absolutely massive, rugged geography collided with centuries of empire building and incredibly diverse populations. So whether you're living in Canada right now or you're just curious about how one of the world's biggest economies came to be, you're going to want to hear this. Let's get into it.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we're covering the First Peoples and Viking explorers. Then we'll get into the clash of European empires, followed by loyalists, rebellions, and borders. After that, we'll hit Confederation and westward expansion, and wrap up with forging a modern, independent nation.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, First Peoples and Viking Explorers.
Believe it or not, the story of human habitation here actually starts a staggering 16,000 years ago. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which used to connect eastern Siberia right over to western North America. And as those early humans moved south while the ice sheets retreated, they didn't just survive, they adapted to some wildly diverse environments. Out east, you had the Algonquian peoples and Iroquoian peoples thriving. Over on the vast Central Plains, the Cree lived as nomads, literally constantly on the move to hunt massive herds of bison. Out west, the Nadine and Salishan-speaking peoples were pulling abundant salmon from the Pacific and building with these towering cedar trees. And up in the absolutely freezing, harsh Arctic, the Inuit peoples ranged all the way from Alaska to Greenland. It's a perfect example of distinct societies being totally shaped by the landscape around them.
Now, when you think about the first European contact in the Americas, I'm guessing Christopher Columbus in 1492 probably comes to mind, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Long before Columbus ever set sail, back in the early 11th century, Vikings led by Leif Erikson set up a short-lived settlement in what we now call Newfoundland. They called the area Vinland. This is the true first European contact in the Americas. We're talking nearly 500 years before Columbus. How wild is that?
Moving right along to Section 2, the clash of European empires. So that early Norse presence, it didn't stick around. The Vikings packed up and this massive continent kind of faded from European knowledge for a few centuries. But when the next wave of explorers finally showed up, oh boy, it sparked a massive territorial tug-of-war. In 1497, John Cabot spotted the coast and claimed it for the English. Then, jumped to 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier claims territory for France. And here's a really cool detail. Cartier actually adopted the local Native American word for settlement, which is Canada, and slapped it right on the map. Fast forward a few decades to 1603, and Samuel de Champlain is out there mapping the territory, eventually setting up the foundation for Quebec.
But here's the catch. Even though Champlain made Quebec the capital of New France in 1608, hardly anyone was moving there. By the mid-17th century, the entire population of New France was just a little over 3,000 people. Think about that for a second. That is a tiny, tiny group of people trying to manage a mind-bogglingly vast wilderness.
Now, as we hit the 18th century, the map of North America is basically sliced into two giant competing European spheres. On one hand, you've got the French holding this huge, sweeping stretch from the St. Lawrence River down through the Great Lakes, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. On the other hand, the British are wrapped right around them, controlling the super lucrative Hudson's Bay Company territory up north and the whole eastern seaboard down south. So you've got two huge powers competing for the exact same resources. Conflict wasn't just likely, it was absolutely inevitable. And honestly, this deep divide right here, it laid the groundwork for the English-French cultural split you still see in Canada today.
Well, that inevitable conflict, it blew up into the 7 Years' War. It was a global fight, really. But over in North America, New France essentially fell in three big, devastating steps. First, the British expelled the French-speaking Acadians out of Nova Scotia. Then came the knockout punch, the fall of Quebec to British forces in 1759. Finally, in 1763, a defeated France threw in the towel and officially renounced all its claims to the North American mainland. Canada belonged to the British now, though interestingly enough, the British actually let the remaining French population keep their language and their legal traditions, a lot of which are literally still in place today.
Okay, let's jump into Section 3, Loyalists, Rebellions, and Borders.
So, with France out of the picture on the mainland, you'd think the British could finally relax, right? Not even close. Almost immediately, their biggest headache shifted south to their own rebellious 13 American colonies. In 1775, the American Continental Army actually tried to invade Quebec. It didn't work. But by 1783, the newly independent United States drew up its borders. And that meant thousands of British loyalists, people who definitely did not want to live in this new American republic, packed up and fled north into Canada.
Because of this massive wave of English speakers pouring in, the British had to reorganize things, officially dividing the region in 1791 into the mostly French-speaking Lower Canada and the English-speaking Upper Canada.
But, as you can probably guess, the friction with their southern neighbors was far from over. Enter the War of 1812. This was a messy, 3-year conflict kicked off by trade disputes and the British kidnapping or impressing American sailors. It was basically 3 years of back-and-forth invasions across the border. In the end, total stalemate. Neither side really gained any ground. But the irony here is that this bitter, exhausting war actually resulted in a lasting peace agreement. They decided to completely demilitarize the boundary, successfully forging what is, to this day, the longest undefended border in the entire world.
Meanwhile, on the home front, everyday Canadians were getting pretty fed up with top-down, undemocratic colonial rule. Taking a little inspiration from the Republic next door, widespread armed revolts actually broke out across 1837 and 1838. Now, the government brutally crushed these uprisings, but the message definitely got through. A big investigation happened, resulting in the Lord Durham Report, which basically said, hey, maybe we should let them govern themselves a bit. That directly led to 1840, when Upper and Lower Canada were finally merged into the single united province of Canada, setting the much-needed framework for real democratic self-governance.
That brings us to Section 4, Confederation and Westward Expansion.
By the time the mid-19th century rolled around, this loose patchwork of separate colonies started to have a realization. If they were ever going to manage this unbelievably massive territory and actually secure their borders, they had to unite. They had to become one political entity. And that builds right up to July 1st, 1867. The Dominion of Canada is officially born. Ottawa becomes the new capital, and while they were technically still part of the British Empire, Canada was now fully self-governing. This was a total game changer. It was the spark that kicked off a massive era of aggressive expansion out west.
Now, we have to be clear here. This rapid push westward wasn't just a simple real estate boom. Pushing west meant expanding straight into lands that had been occupied for generations, and that brought some incredibly severe consequences. It sparked outright armed resistance from the Métis people, a community of shared First Nations and European descent, famously led by Louis Riel. To lock down control over the vast distances, the government rammed through the Canadian Pacific Railway, finishing it in 1885. This whole era is marked by complex treaties, the forced removal of Indigenous peoples onto reserves, and the really tragic rollout of the residential school system, which was specifically designed to strip away and assimilate the cultures and languages of Indigenous children.
And the expansion didn't just go west, it went straight north, fueled by one word: gold. In the late 1890s, a staggering 100,000 prospectors dropped everything and rushed to the freezing, brutal Klondike region of the Yukon, all hoping to strike it rich. Very, very few actually did. But that massive, sudden explosion of human activity up in the remote north actually forced the government's hand to resolve a lingering border dispute with American Alaska. So, in a weird way, the gold rush finalized the modern geographic map of Canada.
All right, final section, number 5, forging a modern independent nation.
Stepping into the 20th century, you have this increasingly prosperous Canada that is finally ready to step out onto the world stage and start snipping those last few legal ties to Britain. World War I really accelerated things. When Canada entered the war in 1914, their massive military contributions on the Western Front proved they were a heavy hitter, deeply cementing this new, distinct national identity. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing. It caused huge internal friction, especially with French-Canadian protests against conscription in 1917. But because of their undeniable global standing, Britain passed the Statute of Westminster in 1931, granting Canada way more political autonomy and putting them firmly on the track to full independence.
Then, World War II breaks out, and Canada suddenly becomes this absolutely vital, secure fortress for the British Empire. Listen to this. In a highly classified top-secret mission called Operation Fish, Britain secretly shipped roughly $56 billion, that's in today's money, of its gold reserves and financial assets right across the ocean to Canada. They were basically hiding the royal piggy bank just in case the British Isles fell to a German invasion. To this day, it is literally the largest transfer of physical wealth in human history. No way, right?
After the dust settled from the World Wars, Canada hit the gas on modernization. In 1949, Newfoundland finally decided to join the Confederation, becoming the 10th province. On the global stage, with the Cold War ramping up, Canada officially linked its defense with the US, becoming a co-founder of both NATO and NORAD to keep North American airspace locked down. But internally, this post-war era was all about building a massive social safety net, including the launch of their famous universal healthcare system. Honestly, this is the specific era that forged the modern, globally minded Canada we all recognize today. Those final, definitive steps toward total independence, they were heavily symbolic and legal. In 1965, they swapped out the old flag and officially adopted that iconic maple leaf design as a unified national symbol. Of course, the country was still navigating some really complex internal stuff, specifically managing the massive rise of the Quebec independence movement through the 1960s and beyond, while trying to keep the whole nation from splitting apart. Then, the ultimate milestone, 1982. The Constitution Act is passed. This historic move severed the absolute last legal strings to Britain, handing Canada 100% full legislative independence.
So, what does this all mean? Well, I think Canada's entire journey is captured perfectly by this idea: a strong national identity that is rooted in resilience, respect, and a common understanding of people's differences. When you look back, it is centuries of messy conflict, endless border disputes, super careful compromises, and wave after wave of global migration that have forged this incredibly diverse, multicultural powerhouse of a society we see today.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to ponder. From prehistoric hunters crossing the Beringia land bridge all the way to a thoroughly modern independent democracy, it's just an unbelievable journey. After 16,000 years of non-stop migration and transformation, how do you think Canada's deeply unique identity is going to continue to evolve in the 21st century? Thanks for diving into the rich, complex history of this truly vast nation with us in today's Explainer.